I talked with Pierre Ferrari, the CEO and founder of Heifer International, a nonprofit working to eradicate poverty and hunger. He sheds light on his initial misunderstanding about how goat farming would affect communities and how this caused a radical shift in his organization. Pierre talks about why the softest of the soft stuff is sometimes the most important when it comes to social change. We explore how NGOs can be more thoughtful about their work and why pretending you're doing it right is dangerous. Pierre relates how he saw a World Bank economist have an epiphany about community engagement and why farmers need working capital. Let's listen. Pierre, thank you for joining me. Again, we're here doing a podcast on failures from the field, and we are looking to talk to some of the leaders in the development field about different experiences they've had as they've been executing their missions in different parts of their career with different organizations. We're looking for people who have experience in the field and have come across challenges that have helped shape how they attack problems in the development sector. So Pierre, I was wondering if you could start out by just articulating, either from or maybe both, a professional, organizational point of view or your own personal point of view, mission statement, and where you feel you can make a difference in the world and how you see your organization and yourself making the most effective change in the world.
Okay, so I'm Pierre Ferrari, President and CEO of Heifer International. The mission of Heifer International is to end poverty and hunger while taking care of the earth. So we've got the sort of three pillars that we try to manage. The effort at Heifer is mostly to focus on income because we're working with very poor, very distressed communities, and their most urgent need is actually income. Even though we may see them as needing nutrition and food, when you actually talk to the community themselves, they need money. And so you could take a slightly libertarian point of view and say, well, if they get money, they can choose for themselves what it is they're going to do with the resources that they've generated. The development sector has a tendency of semi-forcing people to do what it is that they think they should be doing. If only they would do what we tell them to do is sort of a philosophy, which I think is deeply flawed. So in the work that we've done, it's interesting. This may be it may sound contradictory, but we're working in a project in Nepal around goat farming and goat marketing. And we had approached the whole program with the perspective that the effect of the intervention, which is a word I don't really like, was to have an income effect, a nutritional effect, an educational effect, an environmental effect, and also a social impact effect in terms of both cognitive and institutional. So there's a tremendous number of goals. And so the community, the intervention happened, we trained them on goats, et cetera, we did what Heifer does. And then we went and measured, which we hadn't really done very well before. The belief was that these kind of interventions by placing goats in the training was very holistic and actually worked very well. With a primary focus at the time on improving the nutritional status of children who are, where it was documented, were both stunted or malnourished. There was some cognitive impairment in some of the population, et cetera. So it's a pretty serious problem. The parents weren't really aware of it, and it was more the development folks who knew that these statistics, that these phenomena existed. So anyway, we went in there, we did our thing, we started measuring, and what we found was that indeed we generated income to the point where the families we were working with were so engaged in the commerce that we were able to create because of the improvement in goat replication, the size of the goats, the quality of the goats. We taught them almost a whole set of new techniques on how to take advantage of goat farming. Then they began to neglect their children. And we saw a lot of the malnutrition measures that we had, the measures around, the arm circumference, head circumference, stunting ratios and all that were all getting worse, in spite of the fact that the income in these communities had tripled. So we really had to go back and rethink how we approached these communities and the kind of training, kind of emphasis we had on what is the purpose of all this. And it turned out not to be the solution we ended up with the community. It didn't turn out to be an emphasis or a scolding on you've got to feed your children. It was more going back to values, you know, the root values of why that we're all interested in development, which had to do with self-reliance, autonomy, sharing the wealth that's created with the children, with others in community. And we, as opposed to doing more training on nutrition, it ended up going back to why are we all doing, why are we all here? So it went very deep. And we found that once we had those conversations, as opposed to scolding, it actually began to work, and they didn't realize it. They just got caught up in, well, what we see here in New York, in the kind of the gross materialism that's all around us. They had caught up their version of that.
And in terms of that roadblock, how did that change the model?
So we've always had a very strong emphasis at Heifer around cornerstones and values. We call our model values-based holistic community development. And what had happened over the decades is that there was a sort of an erosion of that idea, a decay of the energy behind the importance of the cornerstones. So out of that and a couple of other experiences, we the leadership team and the board reaffirmed our commitment to that, and we began a whole process of, well, what is the right kind of training? How do you actually impart all those values? How do you get the community engaged? How much more time should we be spending on those values? So there was a radical shift back to the past, you know, in a way. And so today we now have a very clear standard on the quality, the time, and the evaluation of whether or not the community is engaged at that visceral level, at that emotional, visceral values level, before we move into the more technical training. You know, how to take care of animals, how to feed them, et cetera, which is very important, obviously. I mean, I think the animals will not survive. But the foundation for that is a set of values, what we call the 12 cornerstones. So it was a radical shift. And also, personally, it opened my eyes every time I went to the field to see whether or not our staff, most importantly, I think, our staff and the communities were actually engaged at that level. So it was a turnaround. We set up a global project led by, you know, we funded it correctly, and we had a very inclusive process in terms of how to have a discussion around it, how to deepen it, what did it actually mean. We trained the board, we trained ourselves. You know, one of the mistakes I think we were making is we're saying, well, it's the values thing is for the community. We're good. Well, we weren't good. You know, we were not good. So all of that. What would you call it? It was more than refreshment. It was like a recognition that we had allowed all this to almost evaporate, and we pretended. That was the worst part of it. We were pretending that we were doing it right.
I can definitely understand that from our own experiences at Ubuntu and colleagues in the sector. I think it's a easy trap to fall into when you start out with certain assumptions, and I understand. It's a very interesting roadblock to bring up. In listening to you, I'm also thinking that with your particular organization, you have an innovative and very clear driving force behind your model. And it's easily translated, I think, both internally and externally. And in that sense is certainly an asset. But I'm wondering if it also can be a hindrance, because you seem to have also a very complex model and a complex theory of community change and development. Do you find that because it's easy for people to get their head around the innovative part of your solution, the core of your solution, that both internally and externally you sometimes have trouble translating the full scope of what is necessary for community change?
Okay, so from a marketing point of view, from an outsider, to talk to funders, whether it be individuals, major gifts or foundation, or institutional funding, there is a general belief in our sector that this community development work is necessary. But I think I can safely say that very few people do it. There's an awful lot of talk about it. Funders are generally not prepared to fund that kind of work because it's soft of soft, it's the softest of the soft stuff. But we really believe it's the most fundamental, okay? It's complicated because you're talking about psychosocial work. Essentially, you have to create a transformation among the individuals, a cognitive transformation from hopelessness, to simplify it, from hopelessness to hopefulness, which has to do with it encompasses things like depression. If you go to these communities who are particularly poor or underserved in serious ways, and you've got all of these psychological impact that prevent them from doing anything productive, except to just go from day to day and essentially believe their lives are fatalistically determined by somebody else, whether it be a god or karma or something. And it's a gross misinterpretation of most spiritual practices, right? So we have to overcome that, and that's hard to communicate. And some communities can switch out of it, or individual can switch out of it within a week. Others it takes months. So some of them are just mired in it and will never escape. Okay, or their behavior shifts towards, okay, you want me to be happy. I'm happy now. What are you going to give me? All right. So there's a trap there of potentially to create dependence as opposed to real transformation. So you've got the personal cognitive transformation that's got to happen, and then you've got the institutional transformation, the connection between all the community members. So you're right, it is complicated, it is very complicated. So our response to this complexity, and also the reticence to fund it, even though there is conversational support, is to do some research. We're using randomized controlled trials, we're using a lot of research so that we can say, with this, look at the impact further down on income, nutrition, et cetera, without it, look at the impact and starting to show comparisons. So we're trying to link back foundational change to the ultimate impact that everyone is seeking. And I think that without that research, in spite of all the anecdotal evidence, which is enormous, it's visible, we will not convince people. We just won't, because it's expensive. It's actually expensive. I don't know if all of us have, know people or have gone through personal, difficulties, and we've used psychotherapy or counseling of some sort. It's complicated stuff at the personal level. And we're talking about communities. Literally, when we're in there, they're all at some level hungry, they lack energy and poor nutrition, and we're expecting to transform these communities into thriving, energetic, situations. So we're kidding ourselves.
It's interesting. Certainly that is exactly what we found in our time at Ubuntu. And during these interviews, it's a repeated theme that keeps coming up, that quality interventions at a community level do cost a great deal of money. And I think in your previous answer, you just articulated, and I hope I'm characterizing it correctly, sort of a status quo in how people fund programs. With the research you're doing, and you partially answered it, but I'm looking for a little more detail. Do you think there's a chance to convince some people and change the mindset and change that status quo in terms of how we fund these programs? Do you hear other voices also?
Yeah, I think so. Some people are much more sensitive. Some donors are much more sensitive to the emotional connection that they feel when they visit the sites. Okay, and that is one of our most powerful tools, including institutional funders. I'll tell you a story about a woman we hired who had. She was in her late 50s, maybe even early 60s, and she had worked for the World Bank all over the world in the area of co-op formation, aggregation systems. I mean, from Kazakhstan to Uganda to everywhere, and at scale. With World Bank kind of financing. And at scale, I mean 10,000 farmers with multiple co-ops and all sorts of arrangements around whether it be cotton or wheat. And anyway, she was arranged, and so we hired her to provide us with counsel on co-op formation and the required systems, governance, controls, et cetera, et cetera. She had a lot of experience, and she was very helpful in terms of what she knew. And we kept telling her about this community development work that we were doing, and she just rejected it. Her model, she was an economist, her model was financial incentives if people will work if there's a certain return on their time or land or whatever. Okay. So we said, well, that's true, but you've also got to get community engagement, community response, and commitment to the idea that goes well beyond, much more powerful than anything financial that we could come up with. She disagreed. I mean, she really disagreed. She thought it was a bunch of bullshit. She's kind of a hard-nosed world banker. All right. So we said, well, we're working in Nepal. We're trying to form all these co-ops for the network that we're building. And she came along and she visited. I was with her. We went along and visited several sites. And her name was Lynn. So Lynn said after 2 or 3 days of visiting villages where we had been working and were ready for co-op formation, more institutional kind of structure, she said, I've been doing this for 30 odd years. I have never seen communities so engaged and so ready to do what they would like to do. And within Heifer, we talk about her all the time. And in the Christian Bible, there's a story of Saul going to Damascus and falling off his horse. So we call that the Damascus moment, because she fell off her horse and stood up as St. Paul, and a complete commitment to social capital. She'd never seen that before, ever, in 35 years of World Bank work. So there is another way of doing this. But how many people can we take to projects? Not that many, right? Now we can take key people, and we do. So we pay attention to that now. And we're always waiting to see when the Damascus moment happens, Struck off their horse by God. It is, and I'm using the biblical allusion not because we're Christian, we're not, but it's just
appropriate. And then just finally, we're sitting here at the Clinton Global Initiative in a week where the world leaders have descended upon New York. And if you, in the dialogues you hear pervading these discussions here and there, if there was one thing that you could interject strongly, one thing that you could change in terms of the dialogue, we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, we're looking at right now, world leaders setting a vision for the next X amount of years. If there was one thing that you could interject from your experience that could help shape or change that discussion, what would it be?
So we work with smallholder farmers, right? So I'm going to take it from that perspective, and there are a whole bunch of other different problems. The most immediate need smallholder farmers have all over the world, and the World Bank has actually done some work on this. And most smallholder farmers deal with crops that are seasonal. And so there is a tremendous need for, per farmer, a relatively low level of working capital. I think the capital starvation of the system that produces food. There's 500 million smallholder farmers in the world. They essentially provide the food for most poor people all over the world. The industrial ag produces maybe 30% of the food the world needs. The other 70% is produced by these 500 million farmers or 600 million farmers. They are in desperate need of working capital. It literally is $2,000 or $3,000 to prepare themselves, prepare their field, buy the fertilizers, whatever it is that they need to actually improve their productivity. It's a simple idea. It's so simple that people are not able to recognize it. But the amount of money required is astonishingly large. You take 500 million and multiply by 2,000, what have you got? You got $1 trillion. That's how much capital is required out there to to actually support the very simple seasonal activity of farmers all over the world. And so that would be my, and it's come up in meetings all the time. People say, the farmers are ready, but they don't have cash to find harvesters or buy the right fertilizers or find the staff to de-weed their farms, or they can only work 1 acre at a time because they've only got their own labor. It's a huge problem. And so we're never going to find $1 trillion, right? And that's not even, that's ridiculous. But at least I can talk to you about it, and I can, again, there's not enough research to show that a couple of $1,000 or $1,500 to a coffee farmer in Guatemala can actually quadruple their income. And these guys are living at an income level that is well below a dignified income level, well below. Then they're hungry, and the quality of nutrition is bad, the girl's not educated, they don't have the money. So a little bit of money, a little $2,000 worth of capital, which is repayable, right? Repayable with interest, can change their lives radically, or can change their income radically. So there's no proof of that. So I'm been waiving the working capital. And we in the United States, if you look at our farming communities, they have working capital. We have a whole banking system, extension service. That's the genius of the American farm system. There's actually a lot of money available to do what they need to do. Now, some of them fail, and the bank takes the land and all that, but there is money. So that may not be the answer you wanted, but it's really fascinating. So we're going to try and find a few $1 million and prove it, and the money comes back. I don't know. I'm like, why are we not doing this?
Well, we will try to put this out there and see if we can help influence.
Great.
Pierre, thank you very much for
Thank
joining me
you.
this morning. I really appreciate it.